Hello everybody, and welcome to Ikoria Lair of Behemoths daily previews for draft, day number 1. Today we're going to be looking at all of the cards I could find from the first day of spoilers for Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, and going over them, analyzing them for limited gameplay. Before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below if you have any feedback or thoughts on the cards. I would love to discuss them with you, but without further ado, we have a lot of cards to dive into, so we're going to get started. First up, we have Huntmaster Liger. This is the first mutate card we're going to be seeing here. I think this card is actually it's going to be solid. I think most of the mutate cards are going to be good just because of the optionality they provide, but I do want to note that it does incentivize mutating over and over onto the same creature, which I'm not sure is a play pattern that you're going to want, because generally you're going to want to make your smaller creatures into bigger sized creatures. I feel like stacking all of your mutate triggers onto one card is potentially just a recipe to get blown out by removal and lose all of your eggs that are all in one basket. So keep that in mind, but I do think Huntmaster Liger is going to be good, especially if there is a tokens archetype. Next, we have Luminous Broodmoth. This card is just fantastic. If you can ever protect the Broodmoth, it's going to be great. It makes it so your creatures just basically can't die, because they're just going to not trade with you until they can kill the Broodmoth. And if they can't kill the Broodmoth, you win the game. This is just a stone cold bomb. Next is Pacifism. Good removal. It's been good in every set it's been in. There are some sets it's a little bit worse, where enchantment removal or artifact removal is prevalent. Keep that in mind. There is going to be a little bit more incidental artifact and enchantment removal running around because of the cycling cards that have that, or the mutate cards that have some extra upside that can kill those. But I do think Pacifism is still going to be a great card. Premium removal for 2 mana. It does work a little bit better in aggressive decks because you can get rid of the blocker, and if they do later remove the Pacifism, hopefully you can kill them before that happens. Next is Sevi Sabertooth. This card, 2 mana 3/1, really varies on how good it is in a format, just based on whether or not there's stuff that punishes 1 toughness. Initially, it's just a 2-drop. You're going to want 2-drops in some of your decks. It blocks really well, but I think that generally you're going to have better things to do with your mana. If you can find a way to get a first strike token onto this, that'll make it a little bit better, but overall just going to be very filler. We're moving on to blue. Essence Scatter is just always a premium blue common, especially in a set with so many expensive Haymaker type creatures. There's cycling in this set, so that means there's going to be some expensive creatures that are going to be cast later on in the game because they have a cheap cycling cost and expensive casting cost, so you can get rid of those big expensive clunky creatures, or you can stop their mutating. It's really going to be a great card. I think Essence Scatter is going to be a high pick. Next is Polliwog Symbiosis. This is actually a really fun build around. It helps you get deck velocity. If you get 1 mutate spell, you can start getting rid of those extra lands, and you can start getting them out early. So you can go turn 2 Polliwog Symbiote, and then turn 3 slam some massive mutation onto it, and you do still get the triggers even if you do mutate. It's not like you have to catch Stid in creature mode to get all of the benefits. So you can go Polliwog Symbiote, make it into a 5/4 on the 3rd turn of the game, and just smash your opponent. It's going to lead to some pretty beatdown draws. But on the other end of the spectrum, it can also be good in a control deck to keep you digging through your deck and finding your good options. Noteworthily, it does work if you cast the card as a mutation or as a creature, so you can still be just developing your board and things like that. I think Polliwog Symbiote is going to be quite good. Next is Wingfold Terran. I really like the design on this one. Normally Hexproof is super annoying, but Hexproof on a 3/6 is a lot less annoying, or you can get a 3/6 flyer. I think because it is so expensive, it's going to be kind of clunky, but I do think it's going to have a home in the format as a mediocre top-end card that you can play in your various decks. On the defensive, Hexproof is generally going to be better. On the offensive, Flying is going to be better, and the fact that you can get either depending on the situation is quite nice. Next up, we have Dirge Bat. This is a very powerful rare. We're moving into the black cards, and this is a great way to kick things off. Basically, just going to get a 2-for-1 every time. You're not really going to want to cast this normally, but having the option is nice. And when you do mutate it, you can then continue mutating. So that's part of this scary thing about it. So you flash in the Dirge Bat as a mutate, you put it on top of your other creature, maybe eat another creature in combat, and then the next turn, if you have another way to mutate, guess what? You're mutating on the Dirge Bat, killing another one of their creatures. Granted, every time you mutate onto the same creature, you are exposing yourself to the eventual removal spell that gets rid of all of them at once, but Dirge Bat does make up for that with some pretty fantastic killing their creature stuff. I didn't think about this before, but Pacifism may get a little bit worse against the decks that care about mutating, because if you say if you pacify Dirge Bat, they can keep mutating onto it to get the trigger, but I guess at the same time, if they're mutating onto the creature, you're probably pretty happy. So it depends on which answers. I guess for most mutate creatures, Pacifism will still be a good answer. Moving on to Gloom Pangolin, just a 3-mana 1/5. This is generally not a great stat line. 3 mana for like a 2/4 is going to be much better a lot of the time because that will be able to actually kill most 2-drops. But in some defensive matchups, you may want something like a Gloom Pangolin. I imagine it's going to be pretty bad in this set, especially because mutation means that in the late game, even the smaller creatures that this would normally blank are going to become terrifying. So I think Gloom Pangolin is overall going to be quite poor. Next is Grim Dancer. This is actually a very sweet design. I imagine that most of the time you're going to be choosing Menace plus Death Touch if you're being aggressive, or Death Touch plus Lifelink if you're defensive. I feel like the Death Touch is really going to make this card scary in all situations, and Menace and Death Touch is really a good combo. If they double block it and you can like find a way to get a pump spell on it, they're just going to lose everything, and then you're going to get to keep your creature. I really like the design on this, and it's going to be quite a high pick. Next is Void Beckoner. This is also going to be quite a good card in the set, though it will be dependent on... I mean, 8 mana is a lot, but I think the set is set up in a way that you're going to be able to get to 8 mana in a decent amount of games. It seems like there's going to be a lot of haymakers going back and forth, so it really will depend, but I think it's going to be like close on whether Mutate rules the day or like these expensive cyclers rule the day, because if you do end up playing like an 8 mana 8/8 Death Touch, your opponent's going to have some problems. Unconditional removal is going to be super premium in this set because of massive cards like this one, but I think the cycling part alone is going to be really good, because there are some really scary mutators. There could potentially be some very early big creatures coming at you with essentially haste, and blocking with a Death Touch creature is a great way to deal with those. So I think Void Beckoner is also going to be great, and never underestimate the power of a cycling card. I mean, these things just do more work than you think they do. Even though 8 mana looks like a lot, in certain decks this card is going to be cast as an 8 mana 8/8 Death Touch, and it's nice to have that optionality. Next is Zagoth Mamba. I'm actually a little bit skeptical on the Zagoth Mamba because its initial setup cost is quite high. So this looks like a great build around, but then you realize that you have to put a 1 mana 1/1 in your deck, and then over time you have to start like putting more and more creatures onto the Zagoth Mamba, and then as soon as your opponent plays one removal spell, you get blown back to the void essentially because all of your eggs are in one basket. Also, the creatures in this set seem rather big, so I'm a little bit worried that Zagoth Mamba will fall by the wayside. I am going to try it out, but I think it's going to be it's going to be significantly worse than most people think off the bat. Like, I think it will be good in certain matchups where you can like kill their creatures and mow them down, but I think most cases you're going to have the Zagoth Mamba in play. Your opponent's going to start like killing your creatures, and overall, like, your opponent's going to like kill your creature that you've mutated onto it, or they just won't have any targets because they'll have like a bunch of 5/4s in play because they've mutated their own creatures. Next is Cloud Piercer. This card looks great. It's a reach creature, so keep that in mind for your own games. There's always that stray reach creature in red, and it's going to keep you churning through your deck to find more mutations. The fact that you can like play this, if you have like an early drop, like say you have a 2/2 in play, and you can mutate this into play on turn 4, hit them for 5, get some deck velocity. Overall, I think Cloud Piercer is going to be a great card in Limited. Next is Drannit Stinger. This card is like the opposite of most typical cyclers in that you'll want it in the early game, but in the late game you can cycle it away for cheap to find more relevant things. It's also a sweet build around for cycling. I think most cycling will probably be in high demand, so it's not like you can generally build a cycling tribal deck, but if that's a thing, it's going to be even better in that type of archetype. So I think Drannit Stinger is also a great card, a 2/2 with pretty decent upside in 2 different scenarios, both when you want to cycle it or if you have other cycling cards. That 1 damage can really add up if you build your deck correctly. Next up is Everquill Phoenix. This card is great. You're generally, like, the way it works is you're going to mutate it the first time, and then if they do kill the mutated creature, you get back a 4/4 flyer, and having a 4/4 flyer is excellent. So essentially, you set yourself up as a 2-for-1 at the beginning, because your creature is going to have to be essentially like eaten by the Everquill Phoenix. But if you keep mutating onto the same creature, you can get more feathers. It's going to be a very interesting balance how much you want to mutate onto the same creature in this format, because the mutate triggers do kind of stack relatively well, I'd say, because you just keep getting feather tokens, and then if they ever kill the Phoenix, you get back the Phoenix. But I think this card is going to be fantastic. Definitely a high quality card, and one you're going to want to first pick a lot of the time, I think. Next is Luca Coppercoat Outcast, and when I first saw this card, I immediately thought of like constructed applications, but in Limited, it's not actually that scary. I mean, it's still going to be great, but as far as Planeswalkers goes, if you are behind on board when you cast Luca Coppercat Outcast, a lot of the time you're going to he's just going to die the next turn because he doesn't really protect himself very well. But if you have like board parity, he can start churning you through your library, getting you extra card draw, and I think it is going to be a good card and a high quality pick overall, just because like in general there's going to be board states where you just play this and just get that extra card worth of value every turn. You can even sometimes get multiple cards if you hit multiple creatures. So I think Luca Coppercoat Outcast is a great card, but not necessarily the type of like game-ending planeswalker that some other planeswalkers are. Next is Yadara Wandering Monster. This card is just fantastic. Like, even without any other text, 7 mana for an 8/8 trample haste with cycling for 2 is fantastic. It's just like unbelievable card. But the fact that you can even get it back if you cycle it in the early game and then still have the option to find it later is amazing. Because a lot of the time you're like, well, I don't want to cycle away my bomb rare, but then you can just draw into it later on in the game. And if you've cycled it enough, you can even get it for free. This card is fantastic. You're going to be slam first picking this a lot of the time, I think, because hitting someone with a 7 mana 8/8 trample haste is just fantastic, and cycling makes that even better. I'm really a huge fan of Yidaro Wandering Monster. Next is the Bristling Bore. This card is a reprint, I think, from M19 maybe. Regardless, this card was like okay in that set. I think it's going to be probably a little bit better in this set because if you mutate onto it, the way that mutate works is it will apply to whatever creature you end up mutating with. So if you mutate this into a 5/4 or a 6/6 or something like that, that creature will still be only able to be blocked by one creature. You're not generally going to want to mutate onto your bigger creatures like the boar, but it could totally happen in different situations where you might want that, depending on what mutate creatures you have. Also, it's just going to be a 4 mana 4/3, so that's never like too bad. So I think this card's going to just be solid, but nothing insane. Next is Colossification. It's a pretty fun rare. 7 mana to make a creature essentially a must-kill threat is pretty good. It's going to depend on how much trample is running around. First of all, I think there is a decent amount of trample from what I've seen, so I think this card could be good for that reason, especially because you can give the creature trample permanently in case they have like tap shenanigans. Also going to depend on how much bounce there is running around, how much unconditional removal, and also how like slow the games are, because maybe you won't have time to do this type of thing in games. But I think giving something plus 20 is going to win a lot of games where your opponent just doesn't have a death touch creature. This guy does look pretty embarrassing against pacifism or things like that, though, so keep that in mind. But I think I'm going to start off pretty optimistic on Colossification. Next is Fully Grown. This is one of those ways to give trample. Giving trample permanently may not seem like a huge thing, but if you are attacking with like a 5/5 and your opponent like goes for a double block and then you play Fully Grown and then your 5/5 all of a sudden has trample for the rest of the game, that's actually a massive swing. So I think Fully Grown is actually better than it looks. Normally paying 3 mana for +3/+3 is a bit overrate. You'd expect to pay 2 mana, maybe get reach and the thing like for Gift of Strength. But with Fully Grown, I think that this card is actually going to be pretty good in the right deck. You're going to want to make sure that you play it in your bigger creature decks rather than your little small aggro decks where you're playing like 2/2s and stuff like that. Because giving a 2/2 trample is much worse than giving something like a 5/5 or a 6/6 trample. Next is Gem Razor. This is a pretty cool card. It's like a Reclamation Sage when you mutate it, which can be just devastating in the right matchup. And even worst case scenario, it is just a 4 mana 4/4 trample, which is also going to be excellent. And it has reach for that extra value. So I think Gem Razor is going to be a high pick and quite good. Next is Kogla the Titan Ape. I really like this call out to King Kong. It cares about humans. It benefits from humans. And it's funny because most of the humans in the set are probably a little bit of a downside because you can't mutate onto humans. So you're going to want to like lower humans in your estimation. And then Kogla brings them right back up. So I think Kogla is actually going to be a pretty good card. It's obviously got a great enters the battlefield trigger. It's got a great attack trigger, and it can even protect itself if you do have some humans. So I think Kogla is going to be a high pick and quite powerful as well. It is heavy green, so you're going to want to keep that in mind. But overall, I think you should take Kogla highly and play it if you can. Next is Mosscoat Goriak. Not much to say here. 3 mana 2/4 is about like generally a subpar card. Giving it Vigilance is like eh. And it's not even like small enough or cheap enough that you're going to want to be like, oh, I'm so hyped, I'm mutating on my creature to get Vigilance. I think Mosscoat Goriak is kind of a miss, initially at least. It depends on how the 2/4 matches up, but my initial thought is that it's a miss. Next is Titanoth Rex. 9 mana for an 11/11 trample. 9 mana is a ton of mana. It really, is a significant jump up from 8 because each turn in the late game it takes you about like 3 extra turns to get that extra land drop a lot of the time, or a few extra turns to get that extra land drop. So you're casting this on like turn like 16 if you get there, or you would have to ramp to it. We're going to have to see what the ramp packages look like. If ramp is a feasible strategy, then Titanoth Rex is just going to be like castable in some games, but also don't undervalue the benefit of just cycling it and getting trample. Imagine if this was an aura that gave a creature permanently trample and you drew you a card. That is the type of card like Cetizen Training in Theros Beyond Death. That's a card that gets played, and this one is very comparable in many ways because it gives the trample. It doesn't give +1/+0, but at the same time, it doesn't expose you to get blown out like Citizen Training sometimes does, and the upside can be quite real if there is enough ramp to support it, which they wouldn't put cards like this in the set. At least my initial thought is that they wouldn't put cards like this in the set if there wasn't ramp to support it. So this is going to be a great card in ramp decks or decks that want to give their creatures trampling, or ideally both. So I think the card's actually going to, again, play out better than you think it will, just because cycling is such a powerful mechanic. Next is Vivianne Monsters Advocate. This card is fantastic. This is exactly what you want in a Planeswalker. It's +1 protects it, which means that you're going to be getting value from the Vivianne's passive, you're going to be getting value from the +1, and then you can also use the -2 in a lot of situations to get value as well. So I think this card's fantastic and a high pick. Next up, we're getting to the gold cards here, winding down with some real powerful cards. Barocos Apex Forever really is a beating to play against. Just constant 6/6 tramples, just terrifying to play against, and they're just coming back over and over. Really makes you want to splash this type of card. High pick for sure. Next is Aluna Apex of Wishes. Not quite as good as the previous tricolor card, but still quite powerful. This one really incentivizes you to mutate on the same creature because you keep getting free permanents. So I'm going to be really watchful if I have this type of card of ways to protect it. Maybe there are ways to mutate a hexproof creature on. Those ones are going to be high priorities. Maybe there's a keyword hexproof that you can get on. I'm going to be keeping my eye out for those because then this type of game-ending engine on a flying trample creature can really just take over. Also, flying trample that you can mutate on and essentially give it haste really just hits quite hard. Next is Labyrinth Raptor. This is a more aggressive version, but because Menace keyword is a thing, you can oftentimes get more creatures with Menace than you normally would be able to, and you get to just like kill their creatures for free, essentially. It's really going to be quite powerful, and I think Labyrinth Raptor is going to be great in a red-black deck, and it's going to incentivize you to build around it and look for cards that can put Menace counters onto your creatures. Next up is Nethroi, Apex of Death. I think this card's also quite powerful. I mean, it's just a theme, but it's like 7 mana if you mutate it, and you just get back a ton of creatures, or you just cast this as a 5 mana 5/5 Death Touch lifelink, which is also just fantastic. So I think this card is going to be quite good, and I'm like excited to try it out. Maybe get some extra self-mill into your deck if you do have a card like Nethroi, Apex of Death. Next is Snapdax, Apex of the Hunt. This card is also going to be quite powerful. This card is going to be great. Double strike on a 3/5 means that like you want generally to have like higher toughness, so the card is harder to kill because in combat it's going to be an absolute beast. Kills a creature every time you mutate and gains you life to help you stabilize. So because 4 damage pretty much always will kill something. I'm just really been impressed with this this cycle of what's it called? The cycle of legendary creatures that have this mutate stuff. Next is Sprite Dragon. This card's a fantastic gold card. I really enjoy this type of card because it starts off small. It's a 1/1 flying haste for 2 mana, which is a little bit undercosted, but then as soon as you start casting non-creature spells, you get those +1/+1 counters, and Sprite Dragon becomes terrifying. It's also really nice ability to have another creature mutate onto, because flying is one of those ones that just makes sure your creature gets in over and over. So even combined with something as simple as the 5/4 that mutates for 4 mana, you can go Sprite Dragon, hit him for 1, next turn maybe cast a non-creature spell, hit him again, and you keep the counters on. So maybe like turn 2 you play this, turn 3 you get a counter on it, and then turn 4 you make it into a 5/4, but it does keep the counter, so now it's a 6/5 flying that's hitting them in and still has the non-creature spell, put a counter on him. I guess it only keeps that ability if it's the top card. No, it changes. It's just like the Bristling Bore. Forget that last statement. It'll still keep getting the counters even if you mutate onto it. This is like the perfect mutate target and really is a super powerful card. I'm really excited to try it out. Next is Vadrox, Apex of Thunder. This is like the Snapcaster Apex creature, I think, which is kind of cool because, I don't know, Snap is kind of like a lightning-themed thing, so maybe it's kind of like a callback to Snapcaster. Maybe that's going too deep. But essentially, this card is going to be getting you back like pretty powerful cards. Like 3 mana or less is generally going to be a pretty good card. Flying First Strike really reminds me of the Jeskai card from Khans of Tarkir. Mantis Rider, there we go. And mutating it is going to be quite good as well. So it's not as good as some of the other ones because getting 3 mana early in the game to cast this might be a little bit trickier, but if you do get in the late game, it can still be quite powerful. So it's a little bit lower than the other legendary creatures we've seen with Mutate, but I still think it is quite good. Next is Gyruda, Doom of Depths, and one thing you need to know about companion creatures is you can still put them in your deck even if they're not your companion, and even in that case, if you just put this card in your deck, you can play it in a blue deck or black deck, which makes it incredibly flexible, and it's going to be super powerful. Like you're going to be milling 8 cards, and there are going to be some truly massive creatures in this set, because as we saw, there's like a 9 mana card that's an 11/11, there's like a 8 mana card that's an 8/8 Death Touch. There's going to be massive creatures, and if you play Gyruda, and especially if you have a couple of those in your deck to like guarantee there's some potential hits, you can like potentially just like get like a massive amount of stats for your 6 mana. And if you have even a reasonable creature, like say you hit a 4-drop, you're getting 10 mana worth of spells for 6 mana, and it's just going to be really powerful, I think. If you do manage to build Companion with this, which isn't necessarily recommended because you'll probably hurt your deck a decent amount. I'm going to try that type of thing probably. I think it's definitely great to have access to Gyruda constantly if you can, or Gyruda, however you say it. Having access to that effect once a game is really good, and then you can always sideboard in your odd-costed spells. It's going to be an interesting deck-building challenge to see if Gyruda is worth the cost, but I would still just take this card highly because you can just put it in your deck even if you don't have only even costed cards. Definitely a great one. Next is Keruga, the Macrosage. I think this card's also quite sweet. Again, remember, you don't have to just play these as companion cards. You can just play them as very flexible early picks. I think I'm going to be first picking pretty much, like, not pretty much all, I haven't seen them all, but a lot of the gold, like, hybrid mana legendary companions are going to be just very good in your deck, and Keruga is no exception. If you do manage to build a deck with no 2-drops, maybe because there's just not aggressive decks in this format, or because, yeah, generally that would be the only way you would do that, because missing a 2-drop is generally really bad. Keruga can be a really nice payoff for that. It's also really nice to just have this in your deck, play it, draw a couple cards. 5 mana, 5/4, draw 1 card is really good. 5 mana, 5/4, draw 2 cards is fantastic. It just gets better from there. So I think Keruga is going to be great on a lot of board states, and I think the way it interacts with Mutate is if you have a few Mutate creatures on the battlefield that are like relatively sizable, like if you mutated on a 5-drop and a 4-drop and things like that, you're going to have a few creatures that are big running around. So Keruga the Macrosage is going to be drawing you a bunch of cards, and I think this card is overall going to be a quite high performer. Next is Lutri the Spellchaser, already banned in Brawl and Commander because otherwise it would just be an auto-include, because its condition is Singleton, which doesn't come up in every deck in Limited, but does come up in a decent number, and if you are in a blue-red deck, having access to this type of effect can be quite good. It's not as game-breaking as the others because paying 3 mana to copy a spell is a little bit harder to like facilitate. If it could copy your opponent's spells as well, it would be much better, but generally this card is still going to be quite good. It's still going to be an early pick. If you can build around it, it's going to be nice to it's essentially just drawing an extra card, and you have the consistency of knowing what that card is, so you can just like take more spells than you otherwise would, especially ones that are better if they're copied. So things like Tormenting Voice, that if you copy them, you don't have to discard again. So you can play Tormenting Voice and Lutri on turn 5, discard 1 card, draw 4. Those types of things get better if you do have Lutri the Spellchaser in your deck, and I think that you can definitely build around it and have a pretty sweet deck. I'm going to be excited to see how it turns out. Next is Mori the Collector. This card, you're not going to be able to build around this in Limited. You're not going to be able to build an only creatures deck, and it generally isn't going to be worth it to build an only creatures deck, even if that is the case. Simply having all creatures is not going to be a winning condition, but again, 4 mana, 4/5 that makes your other creatures cheaper, or I guess you could choose sorcery if you have some expensive ones, is just going to be great. You can play it in your black decks or your green decks, still going to be a very high pick. Just don't fall into the trap of, oh, it's a companion, oh, what's its companion thing? Just imagine if the companion text wasn't there, the card is still going to be fantastic in most decks. Next up, we're getting on to the very end here. Mysterious Egg is very interesting. I'm going to be curious to see if it works out. My initial thought is that it isn't, just because you don't want to have this in a situation where you don't draw your mutate cards. Maybe you do have a bunch of mutators and you don't have really good things to put them on, because you do want cheap things so that you can mutate. Mysterious Egg goes up in value, and I could also see decks where you just start like, you have a couple of things to give hexproof or ways to protect your creatures, and then you just load up on a Mysterious Egg with all of your mutate triggers and just start getting triggers the entire game and grow a massive creature. So I think the jury's still out on Mysterious Egg. I'm gonna start off with it being kind of a cool build around that you can sometimes put in if you have like 7 or 8 mutators in your deck, but you really don't want to be just playing 1 mana O2s that don't do anything. If you mutate, and also a lot of the time you aren't going to want to mutate onto the same thing multiple times, so I think Mysterious Egg is going to start off as being a little bit weak and not something you're going to want most of the time. Our final card of the day is Crystalline Giant. This card is really a sweet design. It really uses the counters quite well, and I think it's going to be quite powerful. I mean, imagine a 3 mana like 4/4 that has like any of these abilities is amazing. It's also colorless, so you can take it early, really build around it. The fact that you can, I think on the first turn, a lot of the time you can play it, give it hexproof, and then the rest of the game you can just start loading it up. You can get it first strike and then death touch. Like if you go hexproof, first strike, death touch, your creature basically can't die in combat, can't die to removal. So those like 3 turns, and it triggers on combat. So you play it pre-combat main phase, you give it hexproof. Next turn you give it first strike so that it can stop smaller creatures. Then you give it death touch, and then it's basically a brick wall that your opponent can never get through. This card is going to be really irritating to battle against. I mean, and then the following turn, just imagine you give it vigilance, so now you're hitting them for 3 every turn, and then you give it a +1/+1 counter, so you're hitting them for 4 every turn. It just really gets out of control over the course of the game. And if you mutate onto it, you keep all of the abilities, so you can even like, it's also a really good mutate target because it's hexproof. I think this card is like fantastic and probably one of the best cards to open pack 1 pick 1 in the set. That's just my initial thought. I haven't seen the whole set obviously, but this card is going to be fantastic. That is going to do it for this video. We really ended things with a bang on Crystalline Giant. Remember, if you do have any questions about any of the cards that I have talked about in this video, ask me about them in the comments section. I'd love to discuss them with you. If you do have any feedback about the format of the video, also be sure to leave that in the comment section as well. Let me know what you thought. I would love to hear from you. Remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future uploads, including gameplay content of the set when it does come out. That is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you folks next time.